I hadn't planned on staying at my friend's place for more than a night or two, but life has a way of stretching short visits into something unexpected. My friend and I had grown up together, and when circumstances lined up, my work bringing me to a city and his invitation to stay with him, it felt like the simplest solution. I arrived with only a bag, expecting nothing more than a spare couch, casual conversations, and the comfort of old friendship. What I hadn't anticipated was how much the house itself, and more specifically his mother, would leave an impression on me. From the first evening, she welcomed me not as a guest, but as if I were part of the family. There was no hesitation in her warmth. She asked about my journey, made sure I had eaten, and insisted I treat the house like my own. I had known her in passing when we were younger, but it had been years since I last saw her. Time had changed us all, but there was something about her presence that felt steady, as though she carried the same calm energy no matter the years gone by. She was the kind of person who seemed to make a home feel alive, filling spaces with laughter, questions, and small gestures that reminded you someone cared. At first, my attention was only on how different it felt from my own home. In my family, meals were often rushed, conversations cut short, and silence filled the gaps. Here, it was the opposite. She asked questions, she listened, she laughed at even the smallest stories. I caught myself wondering when the last time was that someone had leaned in across a table just to hear me better, or laughed so freely at something as ordinary as me complaining about traffic. Her son, my friend, was often busy, caught up in work and errands. That left me spending more time with her than I expected. We found ourselves in the kitchen while she prepared food, or sitting in the living room chatting about everything from the weather to the music she grew up with. None of it felt forced. There was no awkwardness, just a natural rhythm of conversation that built itself piece by piece. She had a way of speaking that made even simple topics feel meaningful, and I found myself listening more intently than I usually did with anyone. I began noticing things I normally wouldn't. The way her eyes lit up when she talked about her garden, the care she put into even the smallest tasks, how her laughter carried into the hall long after the joke had ended. These weren't things that belonged to someone merely hosting a guest. They were details that belonged to someone with depth, someone who lived fully even in routine moments. As days passed, I realized that staying there wasn't just convenient, it was strangely comforting. I woke up to the smell of breakfast already prepared, came home to warm conversations, and ended evenings in quiet company that didn't demand anything from me. It felt less like visiting and more like belonging. I didn't question it then. I just allowed myself to enjoy the rare sense of ease. But somewhere beneath the surface, I knew that this comfort carried something more, something I hadn't yet named. The longer I stayed, the more I found myself looking forward to the moments when my friend wasn't around. Not because I didn't enjoy his company, but because those were the times when it was just me and her, sitting in the quiet house that never really felt empty when she was there. She treated me with the same kindness as before, but it went beyond simple hospitality. There was a genuine interest in our conversations, an attentiveness that made me feel like my words mattered. She didn't just ask out of politeness. She listened, asked follow-up questions, and even remembered small details I had mentioned in passing. One evening, while my friend was out late, she invited me to sit with her in the living room. The television hummed softly in the background, but neither of us paid attention. We started talking about music, the kind that never goes out of style, and before long we were sharing stories about how certain songs reminded us of different points in our lives. She spoke about her younger years, about dreams she once had, and the roads she didn't take. There was no bitterness in her words, just an honest reflection of choices made and paths followed. I realized then how rare it was for someone to be so open, to trust me with pieces of their life that weren't rehearsed or polished. I found myself wanting to know more, not out of curiosity, but because the more she spoke, the more I felt drawn in. She had a way of turning ordinary experiences into lessons, of making her life stories sound like quiet wisdom handed down without effort. And while she spoke, I noticed how close we had been sitting, closer than before, our voices softer, as though the world outside the room didn't need to exist. It wasn't just her words that left an impression. It was the way she carried herself, calm yet strong, graceful without trying. She laughed at the smallest things I said, sometimes leaning forward with her hand covering her mouth, and each time I caught myself staring longer than I should have. I reminded myself of the difference in our ages, of the fact that she was my friend's mother, but those reminders did little to change the quiet stirring inside me. The more time we spent together, the more I felt a connection that was difficult to explain. It wasn't loud or obvious. It was in the silences, in the comfort of sitting side by side without needing to fill the air, in the way her eyes lingered a little longer when our conversations paused. Once, while handing me a cup of tea, her fingers brushed mine, and the smallest spark ran through me. It was such a simple thing, easy to dismiss, yet I couldn't stop thinking about it afterward. I began to realize that what I was feeling was no longer just admiration or gratitude for her kindness. It was something deeper, unspoken, and growing each day. She, too, seemed to sense it. The way she leaned closer when she laughed, the moments her gaze held mine longer than necessary, the comfortable silences that stretched without discomfort, all of it suggested we were both aware of something we hadn't acknowledged aloud. That awareness changed the air between us. Nothing had been said, but I knew, and I believed she knew too, that what connected us was no longer just hospitality or casual conversation. Something delicate and unspoken had begun to form, and though neither of us dared to name it, we couldn't deny that it was there. It happened on a night when the house was unusually quiet. My friend had gone out with colleagues, and I was left alone with her. We had already shared dinner, and afterwards she suggested we sit in the living room. The clock ticked softly on the wall, and outside the windows the world was still. We spoke about small things at first: work, the way the weather had shifted, memories from years past, but slowly the conversation turned deeper, almost without us realizing it. She began talking about how quickly time passes, how children grow up and leave, and how life sometimes leaves you wondering where all those years went. There was no sadness in her voice, only a quiet honesty that I found disarming. I listened, not because I had answers, but because I wanted her to know she wasn't speaking into emptiness. She told me how she often felt unseen, how the world rarely paused to ask how she was truly doing. When she finished, there was a silence that felt heavier than any words. I searched for something meaningful to say, but what came out was simple. You deserve to feel seen every single day. She looked at me in a way that made the air shift. Her eyes held mine, and for a moment neither of us spoke. Slowly, she leaned in, not with certainty but with hesitation, as though she was testing whether the space between us could be crossed. My heart pounded, and I knew in that instant that everything unspoken between us was reaching its moment of truth. I didn't move away. Instead, I whispered words I hadn't planned but had carried inside me for days. I never expected to feel this way, but I can't pretend I don't. Her breath caught, and then she closed the distance just slightly, enough that I could see the tremble in her smile. There was no rush, no sudden action, only a quiet acknowledgement that we had both been holding back something that could no longer be denied. The room around us seemed to fade, leaving only the weight of that moment. She rested her hand gently over mine, and I felt a calmness wash over me. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't reckless. It was tender, careful, and filled with the kind of honesty that comes only when two people stop pretending. We didn't speak for a long while after that. The silence was enough, a silence that said more than words could. Eventually, she whispered that she hadn't expected me to change the way she saw herself, that being around me had reminded her she was still more than the routines she had settled into. I told her that she had done the same for me, that she had reminded me of what it felt like to be truly understood. When the night grew late, neither of us wanted to break the moment, but we knew we had crossed a line that couldn't be unseen. What we shared wasn't reckless passion, it was recognition, two souls meeting in a place they hadn't anticipated. I knew that nothing would ever be the same again, and yet I didn't feel fear. What I felt was clarity, that rare kind that comes when truth finally finds its way to the surface. The days that followed carried a quiet weight between us. Nothing outwardly had changed, yet everything beneath the surface had. Each glance felt charged, each word layered with meanings unspoken. It wasn't something we flaunted, nor something either of us rushed into defining. Instead, it lingered in the spaces between us, a steady undercurrent that neither of us could ignore. I began to notice how naturally our connection fit into the rhythm of daily life. When I spoke, she listened with the same attentiveness, but now there was a softness in her gaze that spoke volumes. When she smiled, it reached her eyes in a way that told me she felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time. Despite the unspoken bond, I knew reality still existed. There were boundaries, responsibilities, and lives that couldn't be brushed aside. I wasn't blind to that. But what gave me peace was knowing that what we had found wasn't about escaping or pretending. It was about discovering something genuine in the most unexpected of places. I had come into that house thinking it was just a temporary stay, a passing chapter, but it had turned into something that would shape me for the rest of my life. One evening, as we sat quietly, she admitted that she had never thought someone would see her as more than just a role: mother, caretaker, someone who made sure everything was in place. She confessed that the way I looked at her made her feel alive again, as though life still held surprises worth embracing. Her honesty touched me deeply, because I realized that beyond the warmth and attraction, what bound us was the gift of making each other feel valued. I told her that what drew me most was not just her kindness, nor the way she carried herself, but the truth of who she was, the depth, the strength, the gentleness that seemed endless. In those moments, I stopped questioning whether what I felt was right or wrong. Life isn't always simple, and love doesn't always appear where you expect it. Sometimes it shows up quietly, testing your courage to acknowledge it. What mattered most to me was that what we shared wasn't built on illusion or pretense. It was real, and real things are rare enough not to be ignored. The last night I stayed, as I prepared to leave the next morning, we both knew our lives would continue with their own paths. But what we had discovered wouldn't fade into nothing. It would remain, etched into both of us as a reminder that love doesn't always follow rules, and that sometimes the heart recognizes truth before the mind can make sense of it. She walked me to the door, her hand lingering in mine, and for a moment the world fell silent again. No promises were made, no grand declarations spoken. Yet in the quiet exchange of one last look, we both understood that we had been changed forever. As I walked away, I realized that life had given me an unexpected gift. It wasn't about possession, nor about permanence. It was about connection, about the kind of rare bond that teaches you something profound about yourself. Some stories don't need dramatic endings. They simply live on in the people who experience them. And this was one of those stories, one I would carry with me not as a secret, but as a reminder of how powerful it is to truly be seen and to truly see another in return.